So, like everyone else on the planet, I recently went to see Doctor Strange Into the Multiverse of Madness. But I've noticed something, strange about some of the reactions to the movie. And it's made me think about a classic story archetype that it seems like quite a few people struggle with these days. Through a combination of serialized stories like the MCU, where characters barely change from their status quo for a whole decade, and rabid online fandom, tragic characters in a story as a device are being used much less, and when they are used, it's usually greeted with revulsion and anger from fans who say that a specific character would never ever act that way. And to go into any more details, this is where I have to say clearly, spoiler warning for Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. I'm just gonna dive right into it in about 5 seconds, so this is your warning. Still here? Okay. So, Wanda. There are a lot of people out there who are angry about what happens with Wanda, and they use a lot of black and white language when they describe that anger. They complain that Marvel made her a villain and a crazy lady, and she would never do that because she's a good person, and so on. But that is the point. Not only of Wanda's arc, but of tragic heroes in general. In the classic sense, a tragic hero is a character that we know is usually a good person, but they suffer from a few tragic weaknesses. Those weaknesses, despite their good intentions, usually lead them down a dark path, and eventually to their own downfall. Sound familiar? Wanda is not the villain of Doctor Strange 2. She is an antagonistic force to Doctor Strange's goals, but she is not the villain. You could say the villain is the Darkhold or the Power of Chthon, but it's not Wanda. She does everything that she does in the movie for love. In WandaVision, we saw her accidentally trap an entire town while processing her grief for Vision. She eventually does overcome that grief, but in doing so loses her children that she's conjured up from nothing. Not only does that re-traumatize her, her realization that her powers are so dangerous means her response is to totally isolate herself. She runs into exile away from anyone who could support her, away from anyone who could help, and grieving for the 2 children she so briefly had, the Darkhold takes its chance. It shows her her 2 boys, tempting her with the possibility of reuniting her family. All she has to do to get them back is take one life, the life of America Chavez. But then Doctor Strange comes to visit, putting himself right in the middle of her plans. She gives him a very polite warning. She says he does whatever he needs to do to accomplish his goals, even when doing that meant wiping out half the universe and eventually costing the lives of both Black Widow and Iron Man. So why is it so bad if accomplishing her goals costs just 1 life? In her mind, she's being reasonable. He disagrees and puts an army between himself and her. To Wanda, he's sacrificing all those lives just to stop her from having a family again. How is that fair? And that thinking escalates on and on through the course of the movie. It's not until America Chavez forces Wanda to confront a version of her children who are terrified of her, and what she's turned into, that she has the clarity of vision to see what the Darkhold has done. It has twisted her desire to see her family again, convincing her that the only path she could take to do so was a dark one. So she destroys it and the temple, and also herself, but not really. We all know she's going to be coming back. Definitely don't worry about that. All that to say, Wanda is not a villain. She is a classic, tragic hero. Those heroes are always a part of painful stories. Their journeys are meant to be uncomfortable to watch. The entire time their narratives play out, we as an audience are internally begging for them to stop. We can see their path only leads to their downfall, and we ache for them to turn away. But they don't. They make their tragic mistake, and then a mountain falls on top of them. The reaction was the same with Jaime Lannister, in an admittedly not great final season of Game of Thrones. But people at the time were so angry. They couldn't reconcile the fact that we had seen him become a good person with his going back to Cersei. But despite his having grown as a person, his tragic flaw had always been that he was in love with her. And so he makes his tragic mistake, and then King's Landing falls on top of him. It's a technique that goes all the way back to Achilles, who gets shot dead because he chooses glory in battle over the love of a family. Or Jason, who breaks up with his wife because he wants a new, more socially respected marriage, and ends up having both his kids murdered, and part of his boat then falls on top of him, and he dies. It seems like things falling on top of tragic characters is a bit of a trope, too. But for a character type this old, it's weird that recent incarnations have seen such backlash and anger online, and honestly, as always, it's probably capitalism that is to blame. Over the last 2 decades of Marvel movies, but not just them, also a whole bunch of TV series across many different genres, we have moved away from the types of stories where characters evolve either for better or worse. And we've started seeing much more of the types of stories where characters only ever incrementally change, so as to not upset the status quo. As an example from the MCU, Iron Man gives up being Iron Man like 3 times, but really each time he doesn't actually, he can't, because he has to show up in the next Avengers movie and be Iron Man again. In a stroke of genius, the Russo brothers use that inconsistent storytelling to shape Iron Man's tragic flaw in Avengers Endgame. He can't give it up. He can't rest. And eventually, that kills him. Which, again, was greeted by anger from fans who have a petition with thousands of signatures begging Marvel to bring Tony Stark back to life. They finally did something interesting with Iron Man, and these people want to take it away. The point is that perpetual stasis of characters is how a lot of stories are told in our modern corporate nightmare. Because if TV or streaming shows or film series change too much, then they might lose viewers, and Mr. CEO Man wouldn't want that. It's the same reason will they won't they romances in sitcoms and dramas usually only resolve in the last season of a show. It's the reason why Bruce Wayne keeps choosing Batman over actually growing and living his life or just helping the city with his money. And it's the reason why NBC chose to fire Dan Harmon instead of Chevy Chase in the 4th season of Community. And that went really well for them. Back to the point, our most popular recent stories have conditioned us away from stories that challenge and shape our characters. And I think that's why we see such strong backlash when they actually do that. And I will say, even though the projects of Phase 4 of the MCU have been a bit hit or miss for me, I do like that a lot of the Disney Plus series and the cinema-released movies have a strong focus on correcting that static storytelling of Phases 1, 2, and most of 3 in the MCU. I hope we get more heroes questioning the legacy of those who came before. More heroes who have made deals with morally questionable gods. I hope Marvel starts to push the boundaries of the universe it has worked to establish, leaning even more into weird cosmic questions. But most importantly, I hope we get more heroes succumbing to their tragic flaws, and then having stuff fall on top of them. So, Multiverse of Madness overall, I enjoyed it, question mark. It was overall, I think, like 7 from me. It wasn't the best thing I've ever seen. It was certainly not the movie I've enjoyed the most of the Phase 4 of the MCU. That would be Shang-Chi. But it has some of the best scenes in the MCU ever. I think the moment when Scarlet Witch arrives at the Illuminati headquarters and rips each of them apart in incredibly graphic ways. That was something I thought I would never see in the MCU. It was something I thought would be relegated to DC Elseworld stories where Superman is the bad guy, which has been seen a million times, and of course, stories that riff on that, like The Boys and Invincible. But it was really incredible to have Scarlet Witch do that, and it shows just how powerful she is. Between that and the broader, more cosmic and existential questions asked by Eternals, I think Marvel is trying to figure out how to push the boundaries a little bit more, and I'm hopeful that they lean more into that rather than returning to a status quo. As fun as a show like Hawkeye was, it can't be all there is. If the MCU wants to continue without being a parody of itself, it has to do more. And I'm hopeful that it will.